A little while ago, we posted a video talking about 5 absolutely ridiculous rules that you shouldn't really listen to if you're getting into music production or mixing or anything like that. They were rules that you see all around the internet that honestly are just a bit bullshit. And the response to that video was overwhelmingly positive. People really, really enjoyed it and wanted to see a part 2. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk about 5 more absolutely bullshit audio rules that you've probably heard a million times that I don't think you should be paying that much attention to. So we're going to dive in and take a look at these 5 rules so you know whether you want to follow them or not. But before we do, my name's Austin. You're watching Make Pop Music. We have weekly tutorials here where we talk about music and music production. If you like this video, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe because that really does help us out on the channel. Also, if you want to support us after this video, you can head over to makepopmusic.com. We have sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, and a start to finish production course. We also have a ton of free content you can download, and we just released a brand new sample and preset pack called Y2K. So go over to makepopmusic.com and check that out after this video if you want to support us. Other than that, let's dive in and let's start talking about these 5 bullshit rules. The first rule that I want to talk about is a rule that you might have seen. It's called LCR panning. It stands for left, center, right panning. And it's a rule where people basically say that if you're going to pan something, it should either be 100% left or 100% right or straight in the middle. It's really kind of an old school technique that they used to use a lot more than they do now, but I've heard it told quite a bit on Instagram and on YouTube. And sometimes it really does work for a song, but sometimes it's just you're leaving a lot on the table. And so I want to talk about that right now. So what left, center, right panning is I have a lead vocal right here, and then I have a vocal left and right. And this is technically LCR panning. So we have the lead in the center, we have a vocal all the way to the left and all the way to the right. What's really cool about this is it spreads out the stereo field really, really wide. So if we listen to this vocal, we're going to have something that takes up the entire stereo spectrum. I feel good. But the bad thing about LCR panning is if you're doing it across your entire mix, you're leaving a lot of different width on the table because not everything needs to either be all the way left or all the way right. There's a lot of things in a mix, especially if you're working in a dense production, that could be 50% left, could be 72% right. There's a whole spectrum of width that you can use to your advantage where things can sit in their own place, things can have their own little moment. And I think if you're following LCR panning, it can get a little bit stale and boring where yes, you're going to have a very wide mix, but there's not going to be things that happen slightly to the left or slightly to the right or kind of move across the spectrum. And so what I want to show you is a couple examples that we have in this song. So, we have some drums here. And we have the kicks and the snares obviously in the center. We've got this wide clap that's kind of a stereo wide clap. But then we have this cowbell that's 64% to the left. Then we have one that's kind of like 50% to the right. And it gives us a cool little call and response, but it doesn't go all the way to the left or all the way to the right. Because when things shift all the way out, they lose a little bit of volume and yeah, they create width, but they're not quite as tangible. So we have these claps that are panned 80% left and right. We have this shaker that's panned 70% left, or I'm sorry, 70% right. We have a tambourine that's panned 85% left. We've got hats that kind of pan in their own loop. And here's what it sounds like. We do get a nice wide drum mix because we have kick and snare in the middle. Then we have all the other percussion kind of panned out. But if we were to take everything LCR, we take this all the way left, let's take this all the way right, let's take this all the way right, let's take this all the way left. It's just going to get a little bit more boring and stale. So here's it now. It is wide, but it doesn't really feel as full to me because everything is kind of just, all the way to the side. So instead of doing LCR panning, pay attention to where you're panning things. Everything is going to be pretty subjective when you start panning. It really just is where do you want things to appear, more than something else. So in this mix, we have a pretty wide mix. There's lots of panning going on, but we use the entire spectrum. Some things are panned 10% left and right. Some things are panned 100. Let's move on to rule number 2, and that is never process in solo. So you've probably seen this on a lot of tutorials where people are like, oh, if you're mixing a vocal, don't mix it in solo, don't EQ in solo, don't compress in solo. And what that means is that if I were, working on this vocal right here that we have from Zach, let's solo the lead, and I'm going to turn off all the send so we can actually hear. Here's what we have. I feel good, better than I ever had, never ever looking back. So what it means to not mix in solo is a lot of people will say, hey, don't go into this EQ, don't start dipping a bunch of things, don't start doing a bunch of things in solo because it could sound completely different in the mix. And I think that there's a fine line to this. I actually really prefer to kind of get the basis of my tone in solo. So what I'll do is I'll kind of like line up the vocal mix, get it sounding pretty good. And then what I'll do is I'll open this last little EQ and kind of start to do that in the mix. So again, this is not something that you have to do. I just find that like if you're never ever mixing in solo, you might be missing quite a bit of annoying frequencies and clashing frequencies and things like that. So let's take a look at this guitar, because guitar is always a really good opportunity. So we have this little cut right here at 3.2 and this little cut right here at 4.4. If I take these and I turn them off, the guitar is just going to be a little bit abrasive and aggressive, and it's going to have this kind of like nasty frequency. And if I do it in the mix, I can hear that there's a slight little gnarly frequency peaking out, but it's going to be really hard for me to pinpoint that if I don't go in solo. So what I'll do is if I hear something in the mix, then I'll go in solo and I'll try to pinpoint that. So then in this song, I realized it was 3200 and 4400, and I took off a lot of 4400. So after I do that to both of these, and again, it's hard for me to find these if I'm not listening in solo, here's what it sounds like. And now in the mix, they're not going to stick out like a sore thumb. Even though we did that in solo, they sound much better in the mix. They don't have that same kind of pokey, really like nasally kind of honky frequency that sits out of the mix. So I love doing that on guitar. I like doing it on vocals because a lot of the time there's going to be something, you know, if we go to this lead vocal right here, there's going to be some kind of frequency. Yeah, right here, you can see that we took off a lot of 4500 because we have some saturation going on in this.
Lost, so lost, stuck deep in a daydream, staring at the cracks in the sky.
And to me, when you're trying to smooth out some of those harsh frequencies or you soothe or something like that, it is a little bit easier to pinpoint that when they're in solo. Just make sure that you don't commit too much while it's in solo because it does need to pop out in the mix. Because you could sit here and you could just keep, you know, getting surgical and getting surgical and getting surgical. And then by the time that this guitar sounds okay in solo, you pop it back in the mix and it's just completely disappeared because it doesn't really have anything left. So people say never mix in solo. I think listen in solo to see if there's things that poke out and then make sure that that doesn't take away from the actual mix as a whole. So definitely feel free to do a little bit of processing in solo, especially with like really, really fine EQ work or really, really, really tight compression. It's a little bit harder to hear things like attack and release when there's an entire mix going. So maybe you listen in solo just to make them really, really perfect, and then you can listen in the entire mix, and you can do your fine-tuning adjustments once everything's playing. The third thing that I want to talk about is the rule that analog is always better than digital. You see this all the time where people talk about their analog chains or their hardware compressors, and how it's so much better than you know, plugins that you might have on your DAW or that you might have in your subscriptions. And I think better is a really, really subjective term. I have some analog gear. I've used a lot of analog gear, and there are definitely units where the hardware does sound better in certain instances. Like I have an 1176 from AudioScape, and it does sound much better than all of my 1176 plugins that I have. So I use that now to track all of my vocals on the way in. With that said, that compressor is $1,000, and an 1176, compressor plugin is like $49 for most companies now. And the thing is, I can only use that on one thing at a time. So if I want to start using it on a bunch of vocals that I got sent stems to mix, I have to basically set the chain up, run it through, let it work as an insert, print that out, and then do it to every single vocal. So while analog could sound better, while it does have certain sonic qualities, the tubes are typically better, saturation typically sounds a little bit better, and it's really fun to play with. It can be a workflow nightmare if your studio is not set up to run analog units. So what I will say is analog has some advantages in terms of sonic quality, but when you're working on a mix that's got 200 tracks and it's got a ton of things going on, nobody's really going to understand or care if you used a real LA2A versus, you know, the Slate LA2A or something like that. I think that if you can kind of get nice tracking chains where you have hardware and it can help on the way in, that's a really, really, really good way to approach a hybrid setup. But other than that, you know, people who try to tell you that you shouldn't be mixing with plugins or that you should be, you know, buying every single analog piece of gear under the sun, it's just not really realistic unless you want to spend tens of thousands of dollars for a simple vocal chain, or unless you want to spend hours and hours and hours sending stuff out, printing it back in, and then just having all of that headache and workflow with recall. So, you know, if there's something that you really, really, really like the sauce of analog-wise, like, you know, the black box is a really cool analog saturation unit, LA2As and 1176s typically sound a lot better as analog units, I think go for it, splurge on them, but I don't think that everything in your entire chain needs to be analog. Most songs that you're hearing on the radio were probably 90% done in the box. So we've gotten to a point where most people aren't going to notice it, unless you just really, really like playing with it, or unless it really stands out to you. I don't think that you should, take all of your time and attention and money throwing it at analog stuff that's going to slow you down. And, the end listener is not really going to tell a difference. So analog's very, very cool. It's very fun. It does have its advantages, but if I'm sitting in a session and I'm working with an artist that wants to get a song done in 3 or 4 hours, I can't be sitting there fucking around with some kind of, space echo or something like that. I just need to throw on a plugin that I'm very familiar with and get it cranking. The fourth thing that I want to talk about is kind of an extension of that, and that is a song shouldn't take a certain amount of time. So I hear a lot of people say, oh, if a song takes you more than a day to write, it's not a good song. And then on the reverse, I hear, oh, if you write a song in a day, you didn't put enough time and attention into it. I have seen artists that can write a song in 10 or 15 minutes, and I have seen artists that take a year to finish a song. And as long as the focus stays there, and as long as you don't get tired of the song and you feel like every time you revisit it, you're kind of adding to it, I don't think that there is a rule for how long a song needs to take. I've had songs that I've written and produced in about an hour. I can show you. I have one right here that I did in the pandemic. It's called Seams. It's like a 2.5 minute song. And I think from the time that I wrote the first little guitar lick to when everything was recorded, mixed, mastered, and finished, it was probably about 2.5 or 3 hours. And then I printed it, sent it off, and never really opened it again. That's not a wrong way to do it. I've also had songs that I've spent months on, just revisiting and retackling and reproducing and, scrapping things, rewriting a verse. I don't think that you should put a limit on your creativity. If you realize that you're the kind of person where, if you don't finish a song in one sitting, you're never going to go back to it, then try to finish it. Try to get it to a point where there's not much that you have to do when you come back. But if you're a person that gets really overwhelmed tackling an entire thing at one time, then go write a verse and then take a break and come back a week later and write a chorus and then come back a week later and do some production. I don't think that you should listen to other people's workflow and really take that as gospel, because everybody likes to create differently. Sometimes it's going to be an hour to make a song. Sometimes it's going to be a year and a half. So don't get discouraged if it's taking you longer than it takes other people that you hear about online. And on the flip side, don't get, nervous if you feel like you're just flying through a song. You don't have to revisit it if you don't think that there's things that needs to be fixed. Trust yourself, trust your gut, and trust your process. And then after the end of everything, you'll have a song, and, hopefully you can be proud of it, whether you made it in an hour or a year. And the last point I want to talk about, rule number 5, that I think is a little bit bullshit, is always use a reference track. So I hear this a lot when people talk about mixing and mastering, is they're like, oh, always use a reference track. Make sure that your song matches a reference track. And while I do think that that can be really helpful, especially for people that aren't in really nice environments with good speakers, I think that every song is so different that even if I'm using a reference track and I am getting it really, really close, I'm not doing what the actual song that I'm working on needs. I'm trying to copy something that somebody did that worked for the song that they were working on. So even this song that I did for Nightbreakers, right? Like, we had a couple references. We were thinking like maybe One Republic meets like The Main meets like older One Direction. I didn't pull all of those songs in and start measuring the LUFs. I didn't start looking at the panorama. I didn't start looking at the actual structure, because to me, I feel like I wanted to do what the song needed. I wasn't really having issues with the mix where I felt like I needed to compare it. So what I like to do, and the way that I like to use references personally, is I'll kind of take a stab at the song, produce it out, write it out, mix it, do whatever I need to do on that song. And then when that song is over, I'll kind of throw it in a playlist of a bunch of songs. And as long as there's not a very, very, very stark difference of, holy shit, that's way more quiet, or that's way more loud, or it's way too thin, or it's way too muddy, then I'm fine, because that's how the average listener is going to listen. They're not going to sit there and they're not going to listen to, Lips by The Main versus In My Head by Nightbreakers and think, oh, that guitar is just a little bit more twangy, or that kick drum, it's just a little bit more punchy. They're not listening to that. They're listening to the song. So as long as those can be on a playlist together and flow, I think that really, really helps. If you are a person that likes using referencing, then I think it can be a nice tool, but I don't think that you have to use a reference, especially if you feel like that kind of bottlenecks your creativity. So if you're using a reference, there are cool, tools that you can use. Like Cubase has Supervision, which is a really, really, really nice kind of analyzer and meter. You've got all of these different things, and this just comes stock. There's also like reference A/B that you can use to make sure that your loudness matches and that your, EQ curves match. Isotope has a bunch of like EQ matching plugins. So if you want to reference, I think just know what you're listening for. Are you trying to get it to sound almost identical, or are you trying to just get it to have a similar vibe? So, if somebody listens to song A versus your song, they're not like, ooh, that was really, really stark and really abrasive. So referencing is cool. I think with anything, Everybody's going to have different speakers. Everybody's going to have different systems. Everybody's going to have different ears and different tastes. I don't think that you should let references control your mix too much. I think you should trust yourself, trust your judgment, and, make sure that you listen to the song when it's done and it fits in a playlist. It fits with all the other references as a whole. But other than that, it's fine. Make sure that the song sounds okay in headphones. Make sure that it sounds okay in whatever car you're comfortable with. Make sure it sounds okay if I listen to it on an iPhone speaker. And past that, if it feels good, if you can still feel the emotion in the song, if the song shines more than the mix, then perfect. It's done. Send it off. You don't have to keep worrying about it. So don't pigeonhole yourself with referencing way too much. Don't be, doing 100 mix revisions because the kick on yours just sounds a little bit different than the kick on, a song that was a reference. I don't think you need to stress that. It's all about vibe. Do what the song that you're working on needs. And that's going to do it for this video. Those are 5 more tips that I think are a little bit bullshit. Again, with all of these rules, there are moments where it is good advice, and there are a lot of moments where it's really shitty advice. So like I told you in the last video, just be really cautious of the advice that you're listening to. I think that the best way to kind of learn is intake all of the advice, try it out, see what works for you, and then adjust it accordingly. So I see a lot of cool tips that I think are really going to make its way into my workflow, and then I try it and I'm like, nah, fuck that, I don't like it. I also see a lot of things that I'm like, that's kind of weird, that doesn't seem right, that then I try and it becomes a staple in my production workflow. So whenever you're listening to people, even this video, any of our other tutorials, any of our friends' tutorials, make sure that you're working on things that work for you. So, you don't have to EQ a vocal like me. You don't have to compress a vocal like Help Me Devon does. You don't have to, program a bass guitar like Beat Academy does. Try to see what works for you, because we're not making your songs for you at the end of the day. We're just trying to show you how we do things, and you have to have a filter to kind of turn that into information that really, really works for you. So hopefully you like this video. If you want to see even more bullshit rules, let me know below. Or if you want to see a video of tips that I think are actually super helpful, let me know below in the comments. We can always do those. If you like this video, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Other than that, head over to makepopmusic.com where you can check out sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, and a course. We also have a ton of free content over there that you can download for nothing. So go check that out. Other than that, we'll be back next Friday with much more content. But until then, much love, everyone. Peace.